Here is a look into some of the key components that make up my philosophy of teaching math, as well as a few personal examples from my placement. One of the fundamental things from this class that I learned was the crucial role the teacher plays in the attitude of the students. Because math anxiety is such a prevalent feeling among students, the teacher must find a way to displace it. For me, creating a positive environment is one of the best ways to go about this. With my students, I tried to create an environment that welcomed mistakes, encouraged positive communication, and made learning fun. I wanted to see the confidence and positive dispositions within my students. In essence, I wanted to see my students go from the first picture to the bottom picture. Theory was a huge aspect that shaped my philosophy. Piaget's constructivism theory focuses on reflective thought and schema modification, which really means that students are more than just blank slates waiting to be filled with information. Instead, students are constructors of their own learning. Knowing this, I strive to be a facilitator of learning rather than a dictator. I want my students to feel as if they are responsible for their own learning. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory is also a great proponent of my current philosophy. He explains the idea of a zone of proximal development, which is basically the brace that supports a student's learning. Through scaffolding and probing, I felt as if I was able to play the role of a more knowledgeable other for my students because I was able to provide them with the support they needed while maintaining their independence. This is an example of when I scaffolded something for my students. Before we moved on to creating tables, I helped them practice simply just writing equations. Once they understood that concept, then I had them create their own table. And you can see that this student carried the concept of an equation to his table by adding in the equal sign. Both Vygotsky's and Piaget's theories highlight the benefit of social interaction, which is why I often incorporated group work and discussion into my lesson plans. In my future practice, this will be something that I will continually seek to incorporate into my classroom. I believe communication among students solidifies learning and produces an environment that is student-centered. The biggest aid in my planning development came from learning about the mathematical process standards. To foster connections, I would often use the focus of my lesson plan to get my students thinking about past lessons. Connections help build the bridge between curriculum concepts and provide alignment for students. Representation is another process standard that I learned holds immense value. Students must have visual representations from the teacher, such as this one shown, but they must also be given the chance to represent their own thinking in different ways. This is why manipulatives were such a large part of this placement experience. I wanted my students to be able to physically touch and see the ideas I was presenting them with, and I wanted to give them the freedom to explore different options. Making them manipulative was such a time commitment, but I believe they were extremely useful. For example, these fraction representations really allowed our students to manipulate fractions in different ways and come up with their own solutions. Vocabulary was another fundamental aspect of my planning and teaching. Specific vocabulary instruction aids in comprehension and meaningful engagement, but it also makes content accessible. When students have more access to the material being presented to them, their confidence and participation will increase. Similarly, when students begin to use academic language, they will be more prepared for when they face those words on a test. From this class, I learned that the purpose of assessment is to uncover misconceptions, support learning, and inform instruction. In this placement, I often made use of formative assessment in the form of a checklist. Checklists were a great, efficient way for me to see where each student was in their learning, while providing input about my current instruction and input for changes about future instruction. The idea of equity within the classroom is something that will influence my instructional decisions in the future. Practicing equity will help close the widening gap among students of different backgrounds. It is one of the 6 principles of learning math, and it is also a focus in Joe Bowler's Mathematical Mindsets book. Equity means having high expectations and high support for all students, and Joe Bowler describes it as having a classroom with a low floor and high ceiling. Having a high ceiling and a high expectation for all students lets them know that you foresee growth in their future, which is extremely motivating for students. On the other hand, low floors and high support allows every student to enter the playing field while giving them the help needed to reach their full potential. One way I implemented equitable practices was by allowing multiple entry points. These fraction cards that you see allowed my students to come up with their own creations and solutions to different problems. This was often implemented during my guided practices, and I believe this goes back to Piaget's constructivism theory because its students were constructing their own knowledge. Overall, this placement put a smile on my face and gave me extra motivation to continue working toward my own class. I believe this experience gave me great confidence and great fundamental beliefs about teaching.